On a crisp autumn morning in Washington, D.C., Supreme Court Judge Amara Richardson woke up earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across her elegant Georgetown townhouse. At 52, she carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from decades of breaking barriers in the legal world. The day started like any other. She prepared her morning coffee, its rich aroma filling her kitchen as she reviewed her flight details to San Francisco. Her daughter Sarah, a promising medical resident at Stanford Hospital, was expecting her for the weekend. It had been 3 months since they'd last seen each other, and Amara was looking forward to some quality time together. As she packed her weekend bag, her phone buzzed with a message from her clerk reminding her about Monday's important cases. Amara smiled, appreciating the dedication of her young staff member, but her mind was already shifting to the upcoming family reunion. She chose comfortable traveling clothes, a soft navy sweater, well-fitted black slacks, and practical loafers. Unlike her usual formal attire in the Supreme Court, today she wanted to travel in comfort. The Uber ride to Reagan National Airport was quiet, giving her time to reflect on her journey. 25 years ago, she never imagined she'd be sitting on the highest court in the land. Growing up in Detroit, the daughter of a high school teacher and a postal worker, she'd learned early that excellence was her only option. Her parents had sacrificed everything to send her to law school, and their faith in her had never wavered. At the airport, Amara moved through security with practiced ease. She'd made this trip countless times before, though usually for work rather than pleasure. The first-class lounge was relatively empty this morning. She settled into a comfortable chair, opened her laptop, and began reviewing a few pending case notes. Even on personal trips, she found it hard to completely disconnect from her work. Other travelers in the lounge were absorbed in their own worlds. Businessmen in crisp suits, a couple planning their vacation, and a few solo travelers like herself. Nobody seemed to recognize her, which was exactly how she preferred it. Despite her prominent position, Amara had always maintained a low public profile, believing her work should speak louder than her persona. As boarding time approached, she gathered her belongings and headed to Gate C4. The flight attendants at the gate were professionally cheerful, processing passengers with efficient smiles. Amara noticed the first-class line was shorter, mostly filled with business people in expensive suits and a few well-dressed elderly couples. She stood quietly in line, observing her surroundings as she always did, a habit formed during her years as a trial lawyer. The morning sun streamed through the airport's large windows, creating patterns on the terminal floor. Regular announcements echoed through the space, mixing with the general murmur of conversations and rolling suitcases. When it was her turn, Amara presented her boarding pass to the gate agent, a young man who barely looked up as he scanned her ticket. "Have a nice flight," he said automatically, already looking past her to the next passenger. She appreciated the normalcy of the interaction. No special treatment, no recognition, just another traveler starting their journey. Walking down the jet bridge, Amara thought about Sarah and their planned weekend activities. They had reservations at Sarah's favorite Vietnamese restaurant in the Mission District and tickets to a symphony performance at Davies Hall. These mother-daughter weekends had become precious since Sarah moved to California for her residency. As she approached the aircraft door, Amara felt the familiar transition from the controlled climate of the terminal to the slightly cooler air of the jet bridge. The flight attendant at the door greeted passengers with a practiced smile, directing them left or right depending on their seating assignments. "Welcome aboard," the flight attendant said brightly as Amara showed her boarding pass. "First class is to your left." Amara nodded with a polite smile and turned left into the first-class cabin. She found her seat, 2A, a window seat in the second row. The leather seat was spacious and comfortable, a luxury she'd grown accustomed to since taking her position on the Supreme Court. She stored her small carry-on in the overhead compartment and settled in, taking out her Kindle for the 6-hour flight ahead. Little did she know that this routine flight was about to become anything but ordinary, and would soon spark a national conversation about prejudice and privilege in modern America. As passengers continued boarding the aircraft, Amara Richardson pulled out her reading glasses and opened her Kindle. The first-class cabin was filling up with the usual mix of business travelers and wealthy tourists. A man in an expensive suit took the aisle seat next to her, offering a brief nod before immersing himself in his laptop. The boarding process was nearly complete when a flight attendant, whose name tag read Jessica, approached Amara's seat. Her expression carried a hint of suspicion that seemed out of place with her professional demeanor. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jessica said, her voice carrying just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I need to verify your boarding pass." Amara looked up from her Kindle, noting that Jessica hadn't made the same request of any other first-class passengers. The businessman next to her glanced up briefly, then returned to his work. "Is there a problem?" Amara asked calmly, decades of courtroom experience evident in her measured tone. "It's just a routine check," Jessica replied, though her body language suggested otherwise. "We need to ensure everyone is in their assigned seats." Amara looked around the cabin, taking in the scene with the judge's practiced observation. She was the only person of color in the first-class section. More tellingly, she was the only passenger being asked to prove her right to be there. "Interesting," Amara said, maintaining her composure. "I've been flying first class for many years, and this is the first time I've experienced a routine check after already being seated." Jessica shifted uncomfortably but held her ground. "It's our new policy, ma'am. I'll need to see your boarding pass again." By now, other passengers had begun to notice the exchange. A woman across the aisle had stopped her phone conversation, and an elderly couple 2 rows ahead had turned around to watch. "Your new policy," Amara repeated thoughtfully, "seems rather selective in its application." She gestured discreetly around the cabin. None of the other passengers appeared to be subject to this verification. Jessica's cheeks flushed slightly, but before she could respond, another flight attendant, Mark, approached. He was older, with graying hair and what he probably thought was an authoritative manner. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, directing his question to Jessica rather than Amara. "I'm just verifying the passenger's seating assignment," Jessica explained, her voice slightly strained. "We've had some confusion with seating arrangements lately," Mark added, though this explanation seemed to materialize out of nowhere. "Sometimes passengers accidentally wander into first class when they're assigned to economy." Amara raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting I've wandered here by mistake?" The businessman next to her had stopped pretending to work on his laptop. Several other passengers were now openly watching the scene unfold. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had grown noticeably tense. "Not at all, ma'am," Mark said quickly. "We just need to verify that I belong here." Amara finished his sentence. Her voice remained calm but carried the weight of authority she'd developed over years of presiding over the nation's highest court. A young woman in the front row had begun recording the interaction on her phone, while whispers circulated through the cabin. The flight's departure time had come and gone, but no one seemed to notice the delay. "Perhaps," Amara continued, reaching for her handbag, "we should explore what's really happening here. Would you like to explain why I'm the only passenger being subjected to this routine check?" The flight attendants exchanged uncomfortable glances. Jessica's professional smile had completely disappeared, replaced by a look of growing uncertainty. "Ma'am, we're just following," Mark began, but Amara held up her hand in a gesture that had silenced many an overeager lawyer. "Let me make this simpler for everyone," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I understand that you're doing your jobs. However, when those jobs involve selectively targeting passengers based on their appearance, we move into territory that demands closer examination." The cabin had grown so quiet that the distant sound of luggage being loaded into the cargo hold could be heard. Even the chatty couple in the last row of first class had fallen silent, all eyes now fixed on the unfolding scene. What happened next would not only change the trajectory of this flight, but would also spark a nationwide conversation about racial profiling in everyday situations, even for those at the highest levels of American society. Amara Richardson sat perfectly still, her posture reflecting years of maintaining composure in high-pressure courtroom situations. The air in the first-class cabin felt thick with tension as other passengers watched the scene unfold. She reached into her handbag with deliberate slowness, her movements calm and measured. "You're asking for my boarding pass," she stated, rather than asked. "The same boarding pass that was checked at the gate, and again when I entered the aircraft. Would you like to explain why I'm being singled out for this additional verification?" Jessica, the flight attendant, shifted her weight uncomfortably. Her colleague Mark stood slightly behind her, his earlier confidence visibly wavering. The businessman in the aisle seat had completely abandoned any pretense of working, his laptop closed as he watched the interaction with growing interest. Ma'am, as we mentioned, it's just a routine. Mark began, but Amara cut him off with a slight raise of her hand. In my profession, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect in the nation's highest court, we pay close attention to patterns. And what I'm observing here is a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior. A murmur rippled through the first-class cabin. The young woman who had been recording the incident leaned forward in her seat, ensuring she captured every word. An elderly man in the front row removed his reading glasses, squinting to get a better view of the situation. I've noticed, Amara continued, that none of my fellow passengers have been asked to verify their seating assignments. Not the gentleman in 1A, not the couple in 3C and D, and certainly not my seatmate here. She gestured to the businessman beside her, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. The flight attendants remained silent, their earlier insistence about routine checks suddenly seeming hollow. Through the economy cabin behind them, other passengers were beginning to crane their necks, trying to understand the cause of the delay. I fly this route regularly, Amara said, her voice now carrying a touch of steel beneath its calm surface. I've never been asked to prove my right to sit in first class after boarding, so I have to wonder, what's different about today? Jessica's face had turned a deep shade of red. Ma'am, we didn't mean to. To what? Amara asked. To make assumptions based on my appearance, to question my presence in this section of the aircraft, to create a situation that has now delayed this flight and made everyone uncomfortable. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the ambient sounds of the aircraft seemed muted, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. A senior flight attendant, having noticed the unusual delay, made her way to the front of the aircraft. Her name tag identified her as Susan, and her bearing suggested years of experience handling difficult situations. Is there something I can help with? Susan asked, looking between her colleagues and Amara. Your colleagues, Amara explained calmly, seem very concerned about verifying my right to be seated in first class. I'm curious about the criteria being used to select passengers for such verification. Susan quickly assessed the situation, her experienced eyes taking in the tense postures of her junior colleagues, the watching passengers, and the phones recording the incident. She recognized the potential magnitude of the situation unfolding before her. Ma'am, I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience, Susan began, but Amara raised her hand again. An apology, while appreciated, doesn't address the underlying issue, she said. What we're witnessing here is a textbook example of unconscious bias in action. As someone who has spent her career examining such issues, I find this moment particularly illuminating. The phrase, someone who has spent her career, caught the attention of several passengers. A woman in row 4 could be seen quickly typing on her phone, likely searching for information about their mysterious fellow passenger. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from tension to anticipation. It was clear to everyone present that they were witnessing something significant, though most didn't yet realize just how significant it would prove to be. As Amara reached back into her bag, preparing to reveal her identity, she reflected on how this moment would soon become more than just a personal incident. It would become a powerful reminder that prejudice knows no boundaries, not even in the most privileged spaces of society. The situation in the first-class cabin had reached a critical point. Susan, the senior flight attendant, stood in the aisle trying to manage a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond her control. Behind her, Jessica and Mark exchanged nervous glances as Amara Richardson continued to reach into her bag. Perhaps, Amara said, her voice carrying the measured tone she'd often used during complex Supreme Court deliberations, we should discuss how this incident reflects a broader pattern in our society. The businessman next to her had taken out his phone and was quietly searching something. His eyes suddenly widened as he looked between his screen and Amara, recognition dawning on his face. He quickly nudged the passenger across the aisle, showing them his phone screen. Ma'am, Susan tried again, if we could just resolve this quickly. Quickly? Amara interrupted, her eyebrow raised. Like how quickly your colleagues assumed I didn't belong in this section, or how quickly they decided to single me out among all these passengers. By now, whispers had begun circulating through the cabin. The woman who had been recording the incident was furiously typing on her phone, likely sharing the video on social media. The delayed departure time had stretched to 20 minutes, and passengers in economy were becoming restless. A new voice joined the conversation. The captain's, coming through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a slight delay. We should be underway shortly. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure. The announcement only heightened the tension. Susan looked increasingly concerned, aware that this incident could have serious implications for the airline. Behind her, several passengers had pulled out their phones, some recording, others apparently searching for information. I think, Amara continued, her voice now carrying throughout the quiet cabin, this is an excellent opportunity to examine how prejudice manifests in everyday situations, even in spaces like this, where one might expect better. The elderly couple 2 rows ahead had turned completely around in their seats. The wife whispered something to her husband, who adjusted his glasses and squinted at Amara with growing interest. "Oh my God!" Someone whispered loudly from the back of first class. "That's Justice Richardson." The effect of these words was immediate. Jessica's face drained of color, while Mark took an involuntary step backward. Susan's professional composure cracked slightly as she processed this information. "Justice Richardson," another passenger repeated. "From the Supreme Court?" The whispers turned into a low buzz of conversation. Phones were raised higher, more people began recording, and the atmosphere in the cabin shifted dramatically. The realization that they had just witnessed a Supreme Court justice being profiled spread through the cabin like wildfire. Amara remained perfectly calm, watching the scene unfold with the same careful observation she brought to the nation's most important legal cases. She had dealt with similar situations throughout her career, though perhaps none quite so public. "Yes," she finally confirmed, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "I am Justice Amara Richardson of the United States Supreme Court. And while my position shouldn't matter, while no one should face this kind of treatment regardless of their title or status, I believe we're having an important moment here." The flight attendants stood frozen, the gravity of their actions becoming devastatingly clear. Susan looked as though she wished the floor would open and swallow her whole. "Justice Richardson," Susan began, her voice trembling slightly, "I cannot begin to express." "What I'd like to express," Amara interrupted gently but firmly, "is that this incident isn't about me personally. It's about the assumptions we make, the biases we carry, and the work we still need to do as a society." By now, passengers in economy had caught wind of what was happening. Some had stood up to get a better view, while others were rapidly sharing the story on their phones. The incident was no longer contained within the first-class cabin. It was becoming a viral moment that would soon spark national headlines. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Flight attendants, please report to the front galley." As Susan and her colleagues hurried away, Amara sat back in her seat, knowing that what had started as a routine flight to visit her daughter had transformed into something much more significant. The next few moments would determine not just how this situation would be resolved, but how it would be remembered in the ongoing conversation about racial bias in America. A heavy silence fell over the first-class cabin as Amara Richardson finally withdrew 2 items from her bag, her boarding pass and her Supreme Court identification card. She held them up without fanfare, the gold judicial seal clearly visible to everyone nearby. "Since we're discussing verification," she said calmly, "here are my credentials, not just for my seat assignment, but for my role in upholding the very constitutional principles that should prevent incidents like this." The flight attendants stared at the identification card, their faces displaying a mix of horror and recognition. Jessica, who had initiated the confrontation, looked as though she might faint. Mark had taken several steps backward, nearly bumping into a passenger's seat. "Justice Richardson," Susan managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, we had no idea." "That's precisely the point," Amara replied. "You had no idea who I was, yet you made immediate assumptions about where I belonged. Consider how many other passengers face similar treatment without the protection of a title or position." The businessman next to her, who had been quietly observing, suddenly spoke up. "I've been flying this route twice a month for 5 years," he said, addressing the flight attendants. "I've never once been asked to verify my seat assignment after boarding." His comments seemed to break a dam. Other first-class passengers began sharing similar observations, their voices mixing with the sound of camera shutters and typing on phones. The story was spreading beyond the confines of the aircraft in real time. The captain emerged from the cockpit, having been briefed about the situation. He approached Amara's seat with a mix of professional concern and personal embarrassment. "Justice Richardson," he said, "on behalf of the entire crew and airline, I want to extend our deepest apologies. This is not how we treat any of our passengers, and we will be addressing this incident at the highest levels." Amara looked at the captain thoughtfully. "I appreciate your apology, Captain, but I think we have an opportunity here. Instead of simply addressing this as an isolated incident, perhaps we could use it as a catalyst for meaningful change." By now, videos of the interaction had begun circulating on social media. Passengers' phones were buzzing with notifications as the story gained traction. A news reporter seated in economy had already filed an initial report with his network. "I would like to speak with your airline's executive team," Amara continued, her voice carrying the same authority it did in the Supreme Court chambers. "Not to pursue any personal grievance, but to discuss implementing systematic changes in staff training and company policy." The captain nodded earnestly. "Of course, Justice Richardson. I'll make sure that happens." Susan, who had remained nearby, suddenly spoke up. "Your Honor, would you be willing to share your thoughts on how we could improve? As someone who's been in the industry for 20 years, I'm horrified that this happened on my watch." Amara's expression softened slightly. "That willingness to learn and change is exactly what we need. Yes, I would be happy to have that discussion." The tension in the cabin began to shift into something different, a sense of witnessing an important moment in the ongoing conversation about racial bias in America. Passengers who had been recording the incident were now sharing it with comments about the dignity and grace with which Justice Richardson had handled the situation. "Now," Amara said, addressing the entire cabin, "I believe we all have somewhere to be. Perhaps we could continue this flight, allowing everyone to reach their destinations while reflecting on what we've experienced here today." The captain quickly agreed, returning to the cockpit to prepare for departure. The flight attendants, still visibly shaken, began their safety checks with unusual quietness. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, nearly an hour behind schedule, no one complained about the delay. Instead, passengers were busy documenting their presence during what would soon become a viral moment in the national conversation about privilege, prejudice, and power. Amara returned to her Kindle, but not before noticing several passengers typing what appeared to be social media posts with hashtags like #JusticeForJustice and #FirstClassCitizen. She knew that by the time she landed in San Francisco, this incident would have sparked a much larger discussion about the everyday indignities faced by people of color, regardless of their status or achievements. The incident was transforming from a personal confrontation into a powerful teaching moment that would soon reach far beyond the confines of Flight 2847. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the ripple effects of what had transpired were already spreading beyond the aircraft. In the first-class cabin, an unusual atmosphere had settled, a mix of embarrassment, respect, and collective self-reflection. Susan, the senior flight attendant, approached Amara's seat with a fresh cup of coffee. "Justice Richardson," she said softly, "I've spoken with our ground team. The airline's chief operating officer would like to speak with you upon landing, if you're willing." Amara accepted the coffee with a gracious nod. "Thank you. Yes, I think that would be constructive." She paused, then added, "Though I hope this won't result in any terminations. What we need is education, not punishment." The businessman beside her, who had introduced himself as Michael Chen, a tech executive, turned to her. "Justice Richardson, I've just received several messages from colleagues who've seen the videos online. This is already trending on multiple platforms. Indeed, at 35,000 feet, the story was spreading like wildfire. Passengers throughout the aircraft were receiving messages from friends and family who had seen the viral videos. News organizations were reaching out to travelers on board, seeking first-hand accounts of the incident. A young law student seated in economy had made her way forward, nervously asking if she could shake the justice's hand. "Your opinions on civil rights cases inspired me to go to law school," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Amara spoke with her briefly, using the moment to emphasize the broader implications of what had occurred. Other passengers began sharing their own experiences with profiling and discrimination, turning the first-class cabin into an impromptu forum for discussion about racial bias. "Jessica and Mark," The flight attendants from the initial confrontation had been reassigned to economy service for the remainder of the flight. Their visible absence spoke volumes about the airline's immediate response to the situation. Midway through the flight, the captain made an unusual announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally apologize for the events that occurred before takeoff. This will be a teaching moment for our entire airline, and we are committed to doing better." The airline's social media team was already in crisis mode. Their official accounts had posted a preliminary statement. "We are aware of an incident involving Supreme Court Justice Richardson on Flight 2847. We take this matter extremely seriously and are taking immediate steps to address it. Discrimination of any kind has no place in our company." Passengers who had witnessed the incident were being contacted by civil rights organizations, news outlets, and social media influencers. The hashtag Justice for Justice had reached trending status, with people sharing their own stories of facing discrimination in supposedly premium spaces. A flight attendant from economy came forward to share her own story with Amara. "As a woman of color in this industry," she said quietly, "I've seen this happen too many times. Thank you for standing up to it so eloquently." The elderly couple who had watched the entire scene unfold were now engaged in a deep conversation about their own unconscious biases. The wife was overheard saying, "We need to do better. All of us." Susan returned periodically to check on Amara, each time with increasing respect and genuine concern for her comfort. The initial awkwardness had transformed into something approaching admiration for how she had handled the situation. As they passed over the Midwest, Amara received a message from her daughter Sarah in San Francisco. The incident had reached her hospital, and her colleagues were expressing their support and outrage. "Mom, you're trending on every platform. They're calling you the first-class justice, though not just because of your airline seat." The irony wasn't lost on anyone that an attempt to question whether Amara belonged in first class had transformed into a powerful demonstration of her true first-class character. Several passengers had rebooked their connecting flights, wanting to stay and witness any potential press conference or statement upon landing. The story had evolved beyond the simple incident of profiling. It had become a moment that would be referenced in future discussions about privilege, power, and prejudice in America. As the flight continued westward, Amara returned to reading her book, outwardly calm, but inwardly contemplating how to use this incident to create meaningful change. She knew that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from unexpected moments, and this flight had become one of those moments. The incident would soon become more than just a viral story. It would become a case study in how to confront discrimination with dignity and how one person's composed response to injustice could spark a national conversation about change. By the time Flight 2847 entered California airspace, the incident had exploded across every major news platform. The videos, shot from multiple angles in the first-class cabin, had been viewed millions of times. News helicopters were already circling San Francisco International Airport, waiting for Justice Richardson's arrival. "This incident highlights what many Americans face daily," commented Dr. Marcus Johnson, a prominent civil rights scholar on a major news network. "The fact that even a Supreme Court justice can experience such profiling shows how deeply rooted these biases are." Social media platforms were flooded with reactions. The hashtag Justice for Justice had evolved into a movement, with people sharing their own experiences of discrimination in various settings. Airlines, hotels, and other service industries were facing renewed scrutiny about their treatment of minorities in premium spaces. Sarah Richardson, watching the story unfold from Stanford Hospital, had to turn her phone off due to the constant stream of messages. Her colleagues gathered around hospital computers, watching live coverage and discussing how this incident would impact conversations about systemic bias in professional settings. The airline's CEO had issued a formal statement. "We are deeply disturbed by the treatment Justice Richardson experienced on our flight. This incident does not reflect our values, and we are taking immediate steps to review and revise our training procedures. We have reached out to Justice Richardson and look forward to her guidance in helping us do better." Civil rights organizations seized the moment to highlight broader issues. The NAACP released a statement calling for comprehensive anti-bias training across the service industry. Major corporations began announcing reviews of their own customer service policies. Legal blogs and websites were analyzing Justice Richardson's handling of the situation, noting how she had transformed a personal slight into a teachable moment about constitutional principles and civil rights. Law schools were already planning to include the incident in their curriculum. Inside the plane, passengers were still processing what they had witnessed. A marketing executive in business class had already written a lengthy LinkedIn post about the experience, which was gaining thousands of shares. Today, I watched a masterclass in handling discrimination with dignity. Justice Richardson showed us all what true leadership looks like. The flight's captain received word that upon landing, they would be directed to a special gate to avoid the growing media presence. Airport security had established a perimeter, preparing for the crowd of reporters and photographers waiting to capture Justice Richardson's arrival. Television news tickers ran continuous updates. Breaking. Supreme Court Justice profiled on commercial flight. Airline faces backlash over treatment of Justice Richardson. National conversation on bias sparked by first-class incident. Political figures began weighing in. The president's press secretary announced that the White House was deeply concerned about the incident. Several senators called for congressional hearings on discrimination in the transportation industry. Major newspapers were already preparing their next day's headlines. Justice delayed. Supreme Court judge faces bias in first class. Above the law? Not when it comes to racial profiling. How one flight exposed America's ongoing struggle with prejudice. Sarah had managed to reach her mother via text. "Mom, there are at least 50 reporters outside the airport. Should I come get you through the private entrance?" Amara replied, characteristically thoughtful, "No, dear. Some moments require us to walk through the front door. This is one of them." As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, the flight attendants prepared for landing, moving through the cabin with a mix of professionalism and lingering embarrassment. The incident had already become required viewing in several airline training departments across the country. Justice Richardson remained calm, reviewing a legal brief as if this were any other flight, but everyone on board knew they had witnessed something significant, a moment when one person's dignity in the face of discrimination had sparked a national reckoning. The media storm waiting at the airport would transform this incident from a viral moment into something more lasting, a case study in how privilege, power, and prejudice intersect in modern America, and how one person's response to injustice could catalyze meaningful change. As the plane's wheels touched down in San Francisco, no one doubted that this story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to reshape conversations about bias and belonging in America's most privileged spaces. 1 month after the infamous flight, Justice Amara Richardson sat in her Supreme Court chambers, reviewing the remarkable changes her experience had sparked across the country. On her desk lay numerous newspapers, all featuring stories about the lasting impact of what had become known as the first-class incident. It wasn't just about that one flight, Jessica had said in a recent interview. Justice Richardson showed us how to turn a mistake into a movement for positive change. The incident had sparked concrete policy changes across the transportation industry. Airlines had revised their passenger verification procedures, implementing standardized protocols that eliminated selective checking. Major hotels, restaurants, and retail chains had followed suit, reviewing and updating their customer service policies. Sarah Richardson, now completing her medical residency, had noticed changes in her own field. Hospitals nationwide were using her mother's experience to discuss bias in healthcare settings. "My mom always taught me that real change happens through education, not punishment," she told her colleagues during a hospital symposium on racial bias in medicine. In law schools across the country, the incident had become a teaching tool. Professors used it to illustrate how systemic bias persists, even at the highest levels of society, and how legal principles intersect with everyday experiences. The Richardson case study was now part of civil rights curriculum in several major universities. The elderly couple from the flight had started a social media campaign called Check Your Bias, Not Their Tickets, which had gained significant traction. Their viral video series featured people sharing stories of overcoming prejudice in everyday situations. Michael Chen, the tech executive who had sat next to Justice Richardson, had implemented mandatory bias training at his company. "Watching how she handled that situation changed my perspective on leadership," he said during a TED talk that had garnered millions of views. The young law student from the flight had organized a national conference on bias in professional spaces, with Justice Richardson as the keynote speaker. The event had drawn participants from various industries, all eager to learn from the incident and implement meaningful changes. The airline's CEO had made good on his promise for institutional change. The company had established a diversity and inclusion board, with Justice Richardson serving as an honorary advisor. Their new training program had become a model for corporate America, demonstrating how to address bias at all levels of operation. Most significantly, Justice Richardson had used her platform to advocate for systemic change. In a rare television interview, she explained, "What happened on that flight wasn't unique. What's unique is that we're finally having an honest conversation about it." The Supreme Court's Public Information Office had compiled thousands of letters from people sharing similar experiences and expressing gratitude for Justice Richardson's composed response to discrimination. These letters now formed part of a traveling exhibition on civil rights in modern America. Sarah had noticed changes in her mother, too. "She's always been passionate about justice," she told a reporter, but this experience showed her how personal examples can create universal change. Congressional hearings on discrimination in the service industry had led to new legislative proposals. Politicians from both parties had come together to support anti-bias initiatives, using the incident as a catalyst for bipartisan cooperation on civil rights issues. The flight attendant who had shared her own story of facing discrimination was now leading workshops on inclusive customer service. Justice Richardson taught us that dignity isn't just for those who can prove they deserve it. It's for everyone, she often said in her presentations. As Justice Richardson prepared for another day on the Supreme Court bench, she reflected on how a routine flight to visit her daughter had transformed into a national movement for change. The incident had demonstrated that while discrimination could happen to anyone, anywhere, so could the opportunity to educate and improve. Sometimes, she wrote in a personal essay for a legal journal, "Justice isn't just about the laws we write or the decisions we make. It's about how we respond to injustice when we face it personally, and how we use those moments to help others face it too." The first-class incident had become more than a viral moment or a cautionary tale. It had evolved into a catalyst for genuine change, proving that even in moments of discrimination, there was an opportunity to build a more just and equitable society.